Okay, I wanted to talk today about politics and power and the way that anthropologists look at them. First of all, what is power? Power is the ability to coerce or force people to do things, perhaps against their will. And at the bottom of this rests the kind of threat of force or the threat of violence. We see this particularly well developed in the modern state level society, but we see it at other levels as well. Anthropologists, like we do with many things, tend to classify um, political structures in terms of a kind of quasi-evolutionary scheme. Not that we really believe that this is necessarily representing real history, but it represents a kind of logical progression. And so the simplest societies in political terms are bands. And they're typically small groupings of people that are relatively acephalous, we would call it. That is, they don't have, I mean, that literally means lacking a head. They don't have formal political office. They would at most have some people who would be what we call task leaders, who would be specialized in particular things such as hunting or fishing, and they would then, maybe have more influence over certain decisions. Um, Above the level of bands is something known as what we call tribes. Tribes generally do have some kind of formal leadership. This may or may not be, um, it may or may not be sort of what we think of as the full executive power. Um, Often, we think of, say, Native American societies in this context. Tribes would have chiefs, certainly. These chiefs would usually not be hereditary. They would be selected often because of, if we think on the plains, selected for heroism or other kinds of extraordinary qualities. They might, in fact, even be elected as the council of chiefs for the Cheyenne tribe were. Um, Above the level of tribes, you have something called chiefdoms. Now, it's a little confusing because tribes have chiefs as well, but with chiefdoms, you're talking really about an actual hereditary system. So, chiefs in chiefdoms have a formal title that they inherit from a father or some other relative, and that title is not just an honorific, but it also is in this way that we use the word title in our society. It also means having title to land or resources. Um, Notions of ownership of land varied a great deal in Native American societies, um, but at the very least, a chief would have the rights to resources in a particular area. Um, so they were hereditary. Northwest Coast is a good example of this. Also, a lot of the tribes in California, they had this hereditary chiefdom that was the leader of some kind of a corporate group. And we talked about the unilineal corporate groups when we were talking about kinship systems. So they would be the titular head of a house or a lineage or a clan. Would have not only the real property, that is the real estate, but they would also have symbolic property, things that they might wear, a crest, like a sort of family coat of arms that they might display, often on poles in front of their houses, that kind of thing. With the rise of agriculture, we also then have the rise of the state, and this happens in many parts of the world. It happens in Mesoamerica, present-day Mexico and Guatemala. It also happened in South America, happened in the Near East, in Egypt, in India, China. So when you have the rise of agriculture, a couple of things happen. One is that there's surplus. The society essentially becomes wealthier. They're not, you know, living hand to mouth. And secondly, there's trade. So people tend to specialize. You're going to be a wheat farmer, or you're going to be a cattle farmer, and you can't I mean, I suppose you could live by bread alone, but most people prefer to, have some butter or some honey or something to go along with it, and so you engage in trade. Once that happens, you have the possibility of, highway robbery and stuff like that, and so you have the rise of protective institutions that regulate trade. They not only protect you from robbers, but they will also very gladly take your tax money. So you have, in the ancient Near East, you have, we see archaeological uh, sites with actually with seals, uh, that were a sign of tax having been paid on goods. So the state gets into the game of regulating trade. It also gets into the game of orchestrating agriculture. So a king or a pharaoh, for instance, would have some scribes or priests who part of their job would be to keep track of the heavens and to note the time of the year that the Nile floods or whatever, to tell people when to plant. And you might further organize gangs of labor gangs to dig irrigation canals or other kinds of very labor intensive sorts of things that go along with agricultural production. So the state comes in. The state has this ultimate coercive power. It has armies. It has police. It can keep an eye on people, and so that's the kind of society that has been in existence now for several millennia. But it's important to note that for most of human history, people lived in a kind of in some sort of social situation which was not coercive, not so much the strong dominating the weak as we have seen in the last few millennia. The political philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and several other philosophers of that era back in the 17th and 18th centuries, looked to groups like the Native Americans and others as actually living in a kind of golden age because they lived in the period before you had the rise of the state with its coercive power, with death penalties and wars and that sort of thing. So anyway, that's just kind of a brief overview. I wanted to spend the rest of the time talking about one of my favorite political structures, and probably that of most anthropologists because it's quite colorful, and that would be the big man type society. Big men tend to rise up in situations, roughly kind of tribal organization, or maybe something between bands and tribes. They're not hereditary leaders by any means. They're people just like anyone else. There are no, formal distinctions among members of the society, but they are people who become important, very influential in their society through their actions. Not through anything they've inherited, but through their actions. They're not the wealthiest people, really, because it's more a question of sort of wealth flowing through them. They're the ones who can kind of raise the capital that's needed at key moments. You had aspects of this even in the Northwest Coast, where although it was a hereditary, that you did have hereditary chiefs, you also had a lot of people who got wealthy through trade or through wage labor in the 19th century, and they would put on displays in the potlatch, very reminiscent of a kind of big man type of situation. So, big men are people who have the willingness to work really hard, or what one of my teachers said, to self-exploit. They would exploit themselves, work much harder than they would need to just to survive, in order to raise resources to put on a display. So the clip that you have, Onka's Big Mocha, portrays a situation like this in the, I think, late 1970s in the highlands of New Guinea. And you see onca, the molka is basically a pig feast. That was the original form it took, and it wasn't just you came in and ate pig. You did that, but then you also got to take away meat with you, take it back home. So you were feeding your neighbors, and even more importantly, your rivals, and maybe even sometimes enemies in a different village. You were also flattering those that might be higher up. So you see how Onca invites the guest of honor is a member of parliament. So traditionally, it was a pig feast, which meant that you had to be able to raise a whole bunch of pigs, more than you'd really want. Pigs are very destructive. They break fences easily. They get into gardens and trample them. They run away, become wild, and become a nuisance. Um, so you really don't want to have to be in a situation of raising more pigs than you need, but that's the situation you put yourself in if you're planning for a molca, up to a year in advance. And you may also borrow pigs from people and that kind of stuff. So there's actually this whole kind of pig financing network that goes on as well. Um, but what ultimately your source of strength is, or your source of wealth is, um, for someone like Onka, is having multiple wives, and that typically is the one kind of thing that big men get that others don't. Um, and what is it about having multiple wives? Well, you quite simply you have more labor at your disposal, both through the wives themselves and through children they may have had with you or with someone else. They all become hands that you can use to raise these pigs during this the run up to a molca. So you have to have that really to be able to at least do a big molca. I mean, presumably, when Onka started out, he didn't have multiple wives, but just worked that much harder. But when he's getting ready to when he's preparing the molca that we see, he does in fact have multiple wives. There's also wealth items involved. Now, traditionally, that would have included things like bird feathers or seashell jewelry, the kinds of things that they liked to use for personal adornment. Remember in New Guinea, it's the men who like to dress up really fancy, and they need all this stuff in order to do so. Um, but there's wealth items, and you see that in this period, whenever it was late 1970s, I think there's quite a bit of cash involved, and he wants to buy a motorbike for the member of parliament, and it's very much what we would call a neo-traditional thing at this point. But that was always part of it, was being able to raise wealth. There were wealth items, and by giving the wealth items away rather than just keeping them yourself, you were able to gain in prestige and you were able to gain in influence. Um, Big men, no matter how high they got, how big they became, they were never really authorities in the sense that they could coerce people to do something for them. They could persuade, they could cajole. They were the kind of person. I mean, we all know people like this. Um, they're charming and friendly, and you sort of want to help them, and they ask you to do something. It doesn't really seem like that much of a chore, even if it turns out to be. So big men are like that. They say, well, they go around to their neighbors and say, well, look, I'm putting on this mocha next month, and I really could use, X, Y, or Z. Would you mind doing that for me? And you're my best friend, and you're great. So it's guys like this, and they gain prestige in society, and as they kind of get bigger and bigger, they might in fact get more wives. They have a bigger household, be able to put on bigger mochas, and so forth. So I see I'm at the end of my time. I will stop now, and thanks for listening.